Okay, what we're talking about, as Bishop Gretchen said, is budgets as ministry plans. But before we dive into that, I would like to get a sense of who's here and how we connect with our congregational budgets, those of us who have joined this. So I would love it if, Bishop, if you would go ahead and launch some polls for us to help us understand how we all connect with congregational budgets.
You're going to have 4 questions. When you're done answering all 4 questions, please hit submit. And you might have to scroll it down to see all 4.
What is question 4?
I think that's an error. I think you really only have 3 questions that we're asking you to answer. I think we have an error in our poll. You can answer choice 1 or choice 2, whichever you prefer. Just pick.
Yeah, that was a mistake. Only God is perfect.
Thank goodness.
I think you actually have to pick one or the other in order to submit.
Cool. Please do that then. Pick 1 or 2, whichever is your favorite.
What about number 3? What does that mean, single choice?
It means you only get to pick 1 answer.
Oh, okay.
All of these are single choice. You only get to pick 1 answer.
Oh, okay. I didn't scroll.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to end the poll soon unless somebody tells me they need more time. All right. I'm going to end the poll and then it should show up. So you ought to be able to see it.
Okay, great. So let's see what we have here. We have a lot of people who are involved in creating the budget, 2/3 of the people here. And we have a sense that probably Vestry and Finance Committee and almost half of the places Vestry and Finance Committee are the folks who really are familiar with the budget and how it's created. And we have the other half range between pretty much everyone, which is great that there are 17% of the people think pretty much everyone knows that. And there are 30% or so, 29% think about half the people. And then there are a couple people who think, well, really it's the treasurer or the priest who really know about the budget. And then as the topic for today that we really want to be exploring, it's interesting that 50% of you are pretty confident that your budget reflects your ministry priorities, which is great news. That is great. Somewhat confident makes it almost 80% of you. So that's a great confidence to have. And we'll talk about what budgets are about and how you can become even more confident about that. And then we noticed that 80% of you like the number 1 better than the number 2. So that's great. All right. So thank you for doing that. That helps me know who we have in the group and think about how I want to approach the rest of this. All right, let me, oh my. Now, of course, I can't find my screen. Let me see about sharing it again. Here we go. Okay. So here's what we want to talk about tonight. We want to talk about how budgets serve as communication tools. Budgets are a way of communicating. They communicate whether you think they're communicating, whether you're intentional about them communicating, or you are not. They still communicate something. And that budgets, we want to talk about how budgets relate to your ministry priorities, and then how you would develop a budget that really is a plan for ministry, that is explicitly and intentionally connected to your ministry and your ministry priorities. And we're focusing on operating budgets. So I want to just be really clear about that. We're not talking about financial reports. These are really different, although they are related documents. Budgets really set and reflect expectations, while financial reports show us how money flows, how income and expenses flow, and also what money is available in what accounts. They're different documents. So we're focusing on the operating budget. All right, so what do budgets actually communicate? Budgets communicate sources and amounts of income. So that's pretty straightforward. When you do your own household budget, you might have multiple incomes in the household. You think about those as different sources of income. And then you have different levels, different proportions that might come from different places. So you can think about it that way too. They communicate categories and amounts of expense. So when we think about a budget, we often think of different categories, different ways of splitting up how we understand what we spend. They also communicate an operating situation, a financial operating situation. How they do that is particularly clear when you think about whether you have a deficit budget or a balanced budget. But it's also true that they help you think about your operating situation. When you think about those sources of income and you think about relative to different things, what are the different sources contributing? So for example, if you are pre-retirement, your sources of income are probably primarily from work. So they are salary and wages. Whereas when you're post-retirement, your sources of income may be things like investments or retirement accounts. Those tell you about your operating situation. Those are different sources. They have different levels of stability, different levels of risk, all of that. And then they also communicate what is important to you. What do you value and what do you prioritize? So as I've referenced, budgets happen in our households. Budgets happen in our organizations. Budgets happen in our congregations. In our households, we can think about what we prioritize in terms of, do we actually budget for a vacation? Do we actually budget savings for our children to go to college? Those kinds of things tell us what we prioritize. The budgeting that we do reflects our priorities. And in our congregations, that is certainly true. If we budget for children and youth, we're saying we prioritize them. If we budget only a minimal amount relative to everything else, that also reflects the priority we are placing there. And so the bottom line is that budgets communicate in our congregations. They communicate about how we think about and how we fund ministry and mission. The whole purpose of a budget is that we're funding ministry and mission. So I want us to look at a couple budget examples. So here's one example of a budget. When you look at this budget, this is, just a made up budget for a congregation. Use the chat function and tell me what does this budget communicate about this place? What do you interpret as you look at this about this place? And if you could use chat to share that with all of us, that would be great. since no one's adding to chat, I wonder if you think this budget doesn't tell us very much. The administrator needs a raise. Okay. Oops. Oh my gosh, that happened. Sorry. That was not supposed to happen. I'll go back to that budget for you. There it is. Yeah, it doesn't tell us very much, right? We actually don't know, as I'm looking at all this, we don't know when we look at congregational expenses, what we're talking about. We don't know when we look at salary and benefits, does that include the administrator or not? Does administration include the administrator or not? We definitely can see, as Lori has pointed out, that pledges are a huge part of the income in this place. But this leaves us with a lot of questions. It doesn't tell us very much. It does say, for example, something which we know to be true in many of our congregations, most of our congregations, that really salary and benefits are the primary expense. Okay, so let's look at a next budget. And again, tell me what you see in this one. And this is going to be the same gross numbers. So the bottom line numbers are exactly the same, but look at a different way of looking at these numbers and communicating. What does this communicate to you? Okay, so they value mission and outreach. Now we can see something more, right? There's more information here. So there's a little bit more that's revealed about priorities, right? You can see what they're putting into Sunday school. You can see what they're putting into youth ministry. You can see more about their mission and ministry. And in giving us that more detail, we have some more sense of what they value. They value communications. Yeah, they're putting a lot of money into communications. The income is up on the right-hand side, up on the right top. Anything else you think you're being, what's the story that's being told with this budget? People are first, building is last. Interesting. Okay. The building rental seems high. Okay, so they're bringing in a lot of money through building use, which might have been a problem during COVID, right? those places that relied on building use income. Wonder what mission and outreach represent. Yep. And what are they putting away anything for long-term needs? A really important question. More on outreach than on ministries within the church. Yeah. Okay, so that tells you something about priorities. So this budget gives you a little bit more detail. I imagine for many of you, this is kind of a familiar looking budget. You probably have more detail if you're the people who are creating the budget, right? You roll things up into these lines. You might have, some sense on music, for example, how much of that is permissions, how much of that is paid singers, how much of that is taking care of the organ or something like that, right? So you might have sublines, but when you share a budget with a congregation, this might look pretty familiar. This sort of kind of detail, this kind of way of communicating about priorities. But let's look at another one. This one, again, I just want to say it gets smaller and smaller because we're getting more and more detail. So please be patient. Take the time to look at it. If your eyes glaze over with numbers, just be okay with taking some time with this one. So here's another version of exactly the same budget in terms of gross numbers. What does this tell you? Yeah, 12% for evangelism. Yep, ministry inside and outside the church, breaking down by mission and vision. A bit too detailed for small congregations. Yeah. Right. Categories that outline specific foci of ministry and mission. And we might interpret that they might have goals, ministry goals in each one of those categories, where they hope their staff and volunteers are going to spend their time and energy. It's not data driven, but feels more connected. Andrea feels more connected to this, right? There's a lot of missional thought that's gone into this. So this is a way of using a budget explicitly driven by your ministry goals to communicate your ministry goals, right? This is pretty simplistic, actually, in some ways. Yeah, Sarah's interested in how the salaries broke down. Yeah. So this is an example of one way to think about budgeting and using your budget as a communications tool, and also using your ministry goals to drive your budget. This congregation, as an example, has developed 5 categories of ministry: worship, formation, caring for one another within the community and caring for their neighbor, and then evangelism. And they have decided how they want to allocate their resources across those 5 priority areas, or those 5 ministry areas. And we, looking at this, can interpret for ourselves how they value those areas relative to one another in terms of the percentage of the budget that is put toward each of those areas. So this can tell us a lot. It can tell us a lot about what a congregation prioritizes. It can also be a tool for a congregation to communicate both internally and externally about the use of its resources for mission and ministry. So just to summarize a little bit. So budgets communicate plans for ministry by communicating an understanding of ministry. What categories do they use? Communicates how a congregation is thinking about its ministry. They also communicate priorities for ministry because the proportional use of resources is very explicitly part of budgeting. And then they can communicate, as Katie said, desired and actual use of paid staff time as well as volunteer time, right? What is it we want our human resources to be focusing on, and in what proportion? So you can note that you can break down the categories of a budget in as much detail as is useful for what you want to communicate and to whom you're communicating it. Someone said this seemed a little detailed for a small place. It might be that smaller places are going to have fewer categories, right? And really be focusing their priorities. It's helpful to be really explicit about what those categories are, so the whole entire congregation, particularly in a small place, has the same frame of reference for how do we understand our mission and ministry, and how do we use our resources to achieve our mission and promote our ministry, advance our ministry. So this is something that some of you may have been familiar with, something called narrative budgeting. And narrative budgeting often comes up, narrative budgets often come up as something people want to create when it's time for the annual pledge campaign, because we know that people really connect with stories of how resources are used as opposed to spreadsheets, right? We want to motivate people to get engaged in our ministry in a financial way. Spreadsheets typically, for the majority of people, there are some people for whom spreadsheets speak louder than stories, but for a lot of people, stories are really helpful. And we think about narrative budgets at that time. Narrative budgets are much easier to create if you start with your mission and ministry goals. That actually leads you directly to a narrative budget. If you think about this last budget, creating a narrative budget from this budget, a budget in words where you're telling people how you're using funds, why you're using them in the different categories, much easier if you have this kind of a layout and a way of thinking about your budget than if you just have a spreadsheet with just categories that are more like budget line items. So think about that as you think about the ways you want to use your budget, communicate about your budget, and also be in conversation in your congregation when it comes time for your annual pledge campaign. So what we want to talk about is then how you approach budgeting from this perspective as ministry planning or as one tool in ministry planning. And I want to just acknowledge there are multiple approaches to budgeting. One approach to budgeting is that you start with projected income or revenue, you calculate your fixed costs, and then you use the difference between your revenue and your fixed cost to fund everything else. This is how, as I was raising small children, my household budget was created, right? Do I have enough money to send my kids to camp? Well, first I look at the income that was coming in, then I look at everything else we have to do to maintain the family, and I figure out what's left over, and I decide what camps can I afford for summer camp. That's a very typical way of thinking about budgeting, and really the focus is on a balanced budget. A lot of organizations start with what they spent last year. They adjust for expected changes in costs and income, and then they decrease or increase categories as needed to balance the budget. So in this case, and this is very typical in organizations, including many, many congregations, so the focus is on maintaining stability year to year, which is an important goal for organizations typically, and also balancing the budget. So the ministry budget as ministry plan approach to this actually starts with the vision and goals for ministry, which is not destabilizing necessarily. It may feel destabilizing the first time, but year to year, it's unlikely that your vision and goals for ministry just completely change 180 degrees. But you start there asking, what is it we know we are called to be doing in ministry? What is our mission this coming year? How are we focusing this coming year? Calculating the funding needed, right? And then assign your resources for that funding. But if your income and funding is inadequate, then you have to adjust your goals. So it's a way of doing that balancing of, are we setting ourselves up for something that's actually achievable? And do we have the resources to do it? How will we allocate the resources? In the end, you also come up with a balanced budget. So it's not that you're throwing the idea of being fiscally responsible out the window, it's that you're entering it at a different point so that the focus is on setting and funding ministry goals. And that's a different starting point that we're suggesting to you that can help connect your budget to your mission and ministry, to your planning, to your mutual ministry agreements, to the many ways that you think about your congregation's life and approach to ministry. Are there any questions before we send you out into small groups? I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see you. I cannot see everybody because we're on multiple screens. So if you have a question and you know how to raise your hand, that would be great. If you have a question, you don't know how to raise your hand and I don't see you and call on you, just unmute and start talking. We'll deal with it. Any questions or responses to this before we send you off into small groups? Okay. Then we are going to send you off into small groups. I will, oh, wait, there was one in the chat. Hang on.
No, that was me putting the small group assignment.
Oh, okay. The small group questions are in the chat. And what they are is we want you, first of all, in your small groups, you'll be with a group of 4 or 5 people. If you do not know each other, please be sure to share your name and congregations. We know you've done a good job of naming yourself on your little window screen, but it's helpful to hear your voice as well. Then talk about how your budget in your place is developed currently. And if you don't know that, just talk about what you do know about your congregational budget. And then think about if your congregation has not been approaching budgets by starting with mission and ministry goals, what might be different if you did that? What might be the benefits and what might be the challenges? So that's what we want you to go and talk about in your breakout groups. And we're going to give you, I think, 20 minutes to go ahead and have that conversation with one another. And then we'll bring you back together. And what we're going to ask you to share when you come back, just to make sure you're paying attention, is we're going to ask you to share what you think the benefits are and what you think the challenges might be. So come back and be willing to share some of what your group has talked about.
Okay, I'm opening the rooms now.
Great. It is always so funny to be the person who sees all the little squares come back on the screen. It can be a little disconcerting.
You and me and
Welcome.
graduating right now, right?
Welcome back. And because none of you came back as soon as you were able, we think that maybe you were having good conversations, and we certainly hope so. What I would love to hear from you is what you talked about with respect to benefits or challenges of trying to approach budgeting this way and trying to use this kind of a budget in your congregation. Anyone may feel free to chime in, although we'll try to speak only one at a time.
Oh, I'll start. Nativity and we had Clay and John, and we all have relatively small churches. Our budgets range from 200,000 to 88 to 30. So that was a wide range. The 2 churches that had the smaller budgets had parsonages or vicarages or rectories, which they rented out. And we all have some of the same problems. I think it sounds as if we mostly fit the model of taking last year's budget and then just seeing what the cost of living increase was and what had then added on to that. Several of us have, I guess all 3 of us have vicars. We don't have rectors at the present time. We are in Lewiston, we're at the call process. And I liked one of the things that I think John was talking about. They were sharing, they were working with sharing a vicar with other folks, and that saved them some money as well as helped with energy in the congregation. We have considered that at Nativity as a possibility, not only for that, but I think that with older congregations, I think we all have trouble in making 5-year plans.
So can you approach a budget? Dolores, did you guys talk about sort of the possible benefits of approaching a budget this way as a 1-year plan?
Well, we did, but I don't think that we didn't really follow that through. You know,
Okay. Did you talk about some of the challenges that might be there for following this way of budgeting?
Well, there's a small group of people, and sometimes the whole the committee goes down to 1 or 2 people, and sharing it with the congregation. I personally think that's a great idea, and I've written budgets for not-for-profits, which do use the narrative approach to the budget, and it is a good thing. And I think it's a great idea. I think that I know that it sounds as if all 3 of our churches here are somewhat overburdened just with staying alive.
Yeah.
In the last year, just in meeting, we've had so much trouble just in communication. And we have a problem with older people in the congregation who do not connect on Zoom. And we've tried to do some things about that, but so
Yeah,
there's
I think what you're raising is really important. And I think size matters in how you approach this kind of budgeting. When you have a congregation where the congregation as a whole is relatively easy to convene in non-COVID times, right? It may not be the same during COVID times. And so your whole ability as community to have the kinds of conversations that are necessary for this kind of budgeting, right? It can have to really be a huge transition. And so just recognizing that, and also recognizing that using whatever means we have, and as you've said, the narrative budget and is a way of being able to describe what we're doing so that the people who think numbers and the people who think words can come together and together see how you are using the resources to pursue mission and ministry, right? That's one of the lovely things about a narrative budget is it reaches people who are numbers people and people who are word and image people together. And so the logistics of how we do that as community definitely vary based on size, based on situation in terms of demographics and all of those pieces. Definitely that is true. Yeah. Thank you, Dolores. Another group, anybody else want to share with us the
I
benefits?
will. It's Tom Pitzer from St. Stephen's. We do a little bit of a combination, Carolyn, which is we highlight our 3 or 4 mission priorities in the budget preparation process with the finance committee of 6 or 7 people. And then we kind of look at last year and we ask the various folks that are responsible for the elements of the budget to come up with what do you need differently in line of these 3 or 4 or 5 priorities we have. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And so the responses we get, we try to correlate to so that they relate to the 3 or 4 mission imperatives. I like your idea of combining a narrative and a conventional detailed budget together. I'm concerned that there's so many numbers on one page that it might confuse folks a little bit, but I like the idea. We've used narrative budgets in the past, mostly as part of the stewardship program, so that people are aware of how you plan to spend your money.
So I want to just be clear. So the narrative budget is different from what I showed you as an example budget. I showed you 3 spreadsheet budgets, right? All 3 of them were spreadsheets. All 3 of them are places where you can put your numbers in and Excel does all the calculations for you, which is lovely. Your narrative budget is when you are actually taking the numbers and using the words to describe why that number is the number that it is. So the spreadsheet budgets, the third one that I showed you is one that could easily be used as the foundation for a narrative budget. And it sounds to me, Tom, like you all move toward a narrative budget for your annual campaign, for your pledge campaign.
Right.
And that you do start with your ministry priorities, looking at them. And it sounds to me like you look at them in a sense of continuity. So year to year, and then you go back to the people who have contributed in the past and you ask them what's new or different if we were to continue to pursue this or to make a shift.
Exactly.
So that's
right on.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who has from their group either benefits or challenges of working with this kind of budgeting? Thinking about budgets this way.
We had a unique group because we had 2 clergy members, one from the church plant, which is working on a budget mostly from grants. And then we have a smaller congregation that they thought the budget number 3 was way too extensive, but everybody kind of concluded that it would be nice to have portions of that allocated into the percentages, such as time spent with where the clergy spend most of their time, to bring conversation together to have conversations with the congregations to say, this is how they spend their time, whether it be worship, whether it be admin, to see how they can readjust their time. So ours was kind of a combination to say they liked elements of it, but kind of like what Tom was saying is do that spreadsheet number 3, but don't hand that out. Basically bring the information of the numbers and how the money is spent. But they thought that that was just too detailed with too many categories. They liked the number 2 budget, but they liked being able to say, this is where we spend our money.
I think it's really interesting that our response to it is that it's too detailed. I find that really interesting. One reason I find that really interesting is I wonder if we're selling short people's ability to sit with numbers a little bit and make sense of them. I gave you 90 seconds, right? to look at something on a screen, which for some of you may be a tiny little screen on your iPad. Imagine it on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Imagine it as something that someone could sit with and look at and have a conversation about. And I want to suggest to you that I think those are different experiences. I have trouble looking at it on the screen, on my little laptop screen. I have a great time when it's on my big monitor, right? It's beautiful. I can see all the numbers. I can read them. They don't feel really cramped. So thinking less about really the minute detail of, could I read the numbers in there and how did it make my brain think to have these numbers on a screen? Think about what it means to people to have that much communicated to them about how your place is allocating its resources for mission and ministry. Think about what it means to people to be trusted with the information being completely and that offering that much transparency. What does that mean for people to be able to see that and be able to contribute to it?
So here's a question I wonder, Caroline. So that spreadsheet number 3, which I think the categories of worship and formation and basically taking care of, being engaged in community care and then outreach and then evangelism. So we're going across, we have columns and rows. I wonder if we had said, for instance, and remember, this is ideally not the priest and the admin and the music director saying how much of their time they're spending on this, but how much of the time, what's the priority for the congregation moving forward? What percentage of the time of our staff and volunteers do we think should appropriately be spent in these categories? Ideally, that's how you think about it. If instead of numbers, it just had percentage, right? So if it said, for instance, 25% of our staff time we think needs to be spent in this area, and 20% in this area, and 20% in this, something like that.
Yeah.
I wonder if that would make things different. I also wonder, for instance, if we had given you this exact same budget or these same spreadsheets with a budget of 50,000 versus 298,000, if that might have impacted the way you thought about it. The exact same categories, just different numbers.
Yeah.
People can understand percentages as related to time.
Yep.
They do that all the time. Percentages as related to dollars is a more difficult concept.
Yeah.
I would submit that the thing you need to do, first of all, if you want to go down this road, is you have to make sure that your mission, your vision statements are clear and that they are words that you can use as budget categories and that lend themselves to that, because I think you'll just spiral into a hole if you try to do it with your existing one if it doesn't say that. I mean, if I was going to try this at St. Peter's, I would go back to the mission and vision and say, let's examine this and let's look for key words that are in there that we can use to show percentages or dollars in budget.
So thank you for saying that, Terry, because I want to say to all of you, I did not just offer you the perfect budget template. That was not at all the intention. Those 5 categories that were across the top that labeled the columns, I chose those because I think pretty much every congregation can relate to
Right.
feeling called to do something in those 5 categories. Those may not be the distribution across those, like what was represented in that budget may or may not be the distribution across those categories in your congregation that reflects your ministry priorities and goals. And the categories in the left that labeled the rows, those may or may not be the line items that are most meaningful in communication of your budget in your place. So thank you so much, Terry, for saying that, because it really is, you need to come up with in your place from that grounding of your mission and vision and ministry goals, the way to use your budget to communicate. Your budget is your tool to use to communicate. It communicates something whether you want it to or not. And if you don't pay attention to stuff, it may be communicating something you don't want it to communicate. But if you want it to if you want to think about it intentionally and proactively as a communication device, go back, exactly as Terry said, to that mission and vision and goals and say, what are the things that are going to resonate in this place to help us focus our use of resources, how we fund our mission and ministry, and keep our congregation together, being able to understand that our resources are being used in the way that we understand ourselves to be called to use them. And that is really one of the things about approaching budgets this way, is that it lets the congregation both be involved in a more visceral way, not just a, does it add up? Do I agree that we should pay the cleric this much, but more in a really missional way, right? Oh, I really see now how what my pledge, what everything else that is flowing into this place is being used for in a way that I connect it to my understanding of our calling to mission and ministry. Is there anybody else who has something you want to add to this before we?
Yes, I'd like to.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Ruth Ann.
I'd like to say that about maybe a month and a half ago, I believe it came from Andrea Farley with an email that had a connection to a series of videos put on by the Lutheran Church, I believe, on creating a narrative budget. And you know, it took some time to create a narrative budget, go through those videos and so forth, but all the spreadsheets are created. They allow you to download the spreadsheets that are behind the picture you eventually come up with, which is a pie chart that shows in our case, it was 5 areas that that came from our mission and our vision statements. And so rather than breaking down the budget, the line item budget, into that third one that you illustrated, it's really done in the spreadsheets by putting in percentages. And so you put in your line item budget for how much you spend, say, on your secretary. And I simply asked our secretary to, given the 5 categories, to give me what percentage of time is spent on the 5 categories. You put those percentages in and the spreadsheet just bumps them into the numbers. So you're not doing the number crunching as much, but you know, really, if you work through that tutorial, I think you'll find that it'll be onerous for the first year, but it will be much easier as you go on each year. And I'm really excited to share this at our annual meeting, because I truly believe that people are more generous about giving if they have a story behind that giving, and the words provide that opportunity for story.
So thank you, Ruth Ann. So there's a tool you can use, right? If you start thinking about mission and ministry goals, and you think about your budget that way, here is a set of tools that's available to you into which you can input what comes out of the budget process. So whatever budget process you use, you can use this to turn it into a narrative budget. What we're suggesting to you is the budget process that you use to create the budget that you turn into a narrative budget should start by thinking about ministry goals and mission. And that is a way to have it help you as a congregation stay focused where you understand your priorities are. It is also a way to help you figure out where do we need to bring in more and where do we need to let go of some things? Like what do we no longer actually prioritize, but we've kept funding? And so it can help you answer both of those questions. And I know the bishop has a story about that, but I want to make sure, I think, Maxine, did you have your hand up before I turn to the bishop to ask her for a story? Somebody else? Have their hand up?
I could say one thing. I'm sorry. Just
Go ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that presentation, because we have done the mission part in the 4 or 5 pieces as part of the stewardship campaign, and not so much as part of the final budget presentation. But you've given me some very interesting things to think about to combine them. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. There was somebody else.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Ellie Shapton from Moses Lake.
Thank you.
Is there a place in this process to include ministry work, if you will, ministry done in the community that is not financial? There's no financial component. What I'm thinking of, I've always served very tiny churches, very small churches. And the folks that I've ministered with have always been involved in their communities, doing extraordinary things, but not necessarily in the name of the church.
Mhm. Mhm.
Maybe in the name of Christ, but not in the name of the church. How do we give credit, if you will, although that sounds like a terrible term, how do we include those things in a narrative budget to show folks these are the kinds of things that we are doing, even if it's not identified as being part of the congregation?
So that really gets to the point of what's the budget about communicating and what's a sort of an overall picture of how we are stewards and engaging in stewardship. And those really are two different things. Our annual pledge campaign, it's one reason why I think a lot of people are trying to be careful not to call it a stewardship campaign, because stewardship is bigger than our annual pledge campaign. And so one of the things that, Ellie, that you're pointing out is that we use our budget as one component of thinking of how we are stewards, how we are stewarding our resources. And our budget is how we are stewarding our financial resources. And there are many other resources that we steward. And one of the things that you're pointing out, which I think is valuable for some places to do, and I know some places that have really put some attention to this, is understanding when we think about our congregation as a community of people who are disciples, who are trying to live as disciples, both when they're in this particular church community and when they're in their broader community, they are exhibiting and living our ministry, right, in ways that may not be directly attributable to financial resources from the congregation, but are certainly related to their faith and motivated by their faith and an expression of their understanding of mission and ministry.
My other concern for that is that for those of us that have served in tiny, tiny churches, and for our lay people, that for us, budget has so often been, do we have enough to pay the electric bill?
Yep.
And our askings. I mean, that's the level we're dealing with year after year. One year in Grand Coulee, many years ago, we did the annual meeting, and the balance sheet at the end of the annual meeting was $2.63.
Yeah.
That's reality.
And
It wasn't good. It wasn't anything I was proud of, but that's reality. And when you deal with that reality and you don't recognize the other stuff, the stuff that people are doing, that can become very, very
Demoralizing.
Demoralizing, that's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it is, because you work and you work and you work, and you hear all these things about, oh, we can choose to do, we can, and everything is going to literally paying the electric bill.
Yeah. And that's a time I think that we all know we face
Yes.
some hard choices about priorities and how we live them, and what function the things we are paying for pay in terms of our understanding of our call to mission and ministry, and what function the things we do without pay contribute to that. And I think those are really hard and important questions.
Yeah.
And I actually think approaching budgeting this way helps us face those in some more direct ways. And hopefully what we can see when we then people are giving so much of themselves, we can remove it from being demoralizing. Because if we have these ministry goals and we understand our resources to be more than our budget, then we can be thinking about, so how are we using all that we have for our ministry? Which is not to diminish that it still raises really important questions about why we're paying the electrical bill on a place that is making us have $2.63 left, or
Right.
whatever the number was, right? I want to go
We
to
don't
Jan.
exist anymore. Does that give you a clue? Yeah.
I want to go to Jan because she has her hand up, and then we're going to tell a few stories and close up. Yeah, Jan.
I just want to say that in the narrative budget for All Saints, when I was there, we had a huge amount of pastoral care that was done by volunteers. And if we just wrote up the narrative budget on the budgeting of money, people would say, but don't we do anything for people? And so I always annotated in there and documented what Ellie is talking about, the tremendous amount of the stewardship of time and care and love was expressed in there. So people could see we're doing a ton of pastoral care. It just doesn't cost very much because it's being done by volunteers, as opposed to the things, the electric bill is not a volunteer situation. So I think it's important when you have those things to express that people can see the value and whatever umbrella you call it, the value of the time as well as the money.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why a narrative budget and one of these budget, which is a funding budget, are different. Your operating budget and your narrative budget are different. Your operating budget feeds and is a foundation for your narrative budget. And it's really important to remember that your narrative budget can talk about more than just the financial resources, right? It can talk about the overall resources, which is why it's so useful for your annual pledge campaign. So if nobody else has anything else right now, I do want to say that there are ways that you can use this to both identify how do you allocate what you've already got, but also to think about what else do you need and to pursue it. And the bishop raised one of these when we were talking earlier. So I'd like you to share that story, Bishop, if you would.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that volunteer time does not just exist at really small churches.
Mm-hmm.
And not a lot of money in the bank at the end of the year does not just exist at really small churches, right? But that volunteer time exists in small churches, medium-sized, large, and on the diocesan level. If we were to count up all the hours that people give of themselves for the mission and ministry of the work of this entire diocese as a whole, including time you have given tonight, it would be tremendous. And so I think part of that is to really say, we need to recognize and value and honor the time that people give. And we also have to be good stewards of the financial side of things to make sure that it's in alignment with the mission ministry and the volunteer time that we're asking people to give. So one of the examples I would say is that when I became bishop, we have the mission statement of forming disciples of Jesus Christ in strong communities of faith. And what we say is, our vision is to be creative, compelling witnesses to Jesus Christ. So how do we actually do that, right? And does the diocesan budget as a whole, could you reflect by looking at it that our priorities, our mission and vision is to form disciples of Jesus Christ in strong communities of faith? So the way we list our budget now talks about the office of the bishop. A diocese has to have a bishop. That's by definition. And then we have strengthening faith communities, and we have discipleship and formation and action. And then we have reserve funds because you have a bishop that believes in looking ahead. and knowing what the expenses are going to be down the road. And I harp on this. But what we didn't have in terms of our actual people, personnel, is somebody to really think about discipleship, right? And so looking at the budget, looking at how do we fund that. And remember, Caroline said, you look at your mission and vision priorities, and then you look at where you're getting money. And if it's not consistent, you got to figure out what you're going to do. Well, one of the things I did is I went after money and I wrote a grant, right? So that we could fund somebody who could come in and work in discipleship. You know, and I think part of what we're thinking about is how do we really say, what is our mission and vision? And are we doing it? And what would it take? And I think that's one of the key reasons why Caroline's saying start here, which I want to emphasize is different from saying, how do I communicate the budget I have? The narrative budget is usually, how do I communicate the budget I have? Budgeting from mission and vision is how do I allocate resources to live into the mission and vision? They ought to be in alignment, but the one is a starting point for thinking about allocating resources, and one is a way of communicating the allocation you have done. Right? And they are different. So I want to really emphasize that. And the necessity of always saying there are lots of non-financial, non-budgeted resources and treasures that include people time. And sometimes that people time is the fact that staff work way above the formal hours that we pay people for across the board, or that our volunteers give way more time than we've asked them for. So I think, but it's critical to say, if this is our mission and vision and we're not funding it, do we give it up or do we go after the funding? And what does that look like?
Thank you. So I'm going to just share a few key takeaways from all of this that we want to make sure that you walk away with. So one of them is that budgets do communicate. And we ought to be intentional about where we're communicating with our budgets. If our budgets are indecipherable because they are 185 line items that we are sharing with our congregants, they're communicating this is way too much for you. And what we care about is minute details. and we don't really want you to understand it, right? Budgets communicate what we value because they show how we distribute our resources to fund our mission and ministry. And we want to think about how we use them to communicate. So the way we develop them, not only the way we format them, but the way we develop them affects how well they can communicate. And if we start with ministry priorities, we're more likely to accurately communicate our ministry priorities. This next one is really important. The people who are involved in developing a budget should be the same people who are responsible for achieving the vision, mission, and goals for ministry. Let's flip that around. The people who are responsible for achieving the vision, mission, and goals for ministry should be the same people who are involved in developing a budget. So this means that if you have a lot of volunteers, congregants who are responsible for achieving the vision, mission, and goals for ministry and are not on your vestry, they should be involved in helping to develop the budget. And this is a big change for a lot of places. So that's something that we really want you to know and think about. And just really the bottom line, of course, because that was the whole name of this presentation, is that budgets are and can be used as plans for ministry. So they can be used to both set your intentions and follow and track how well you're doing relative to your intentions. I don't know what just happened, but anyway, there we go. So any other closing questions or thoughts about these points or anything else today? Bishop, do you want to close us and